Ever since Max Verstappen decided to occupy the top step of the podium for all his rivals, with victory ambitions, a very tough period began in Formula One. In fact, for about a year now, the possibility of winning a Grand Prix is no longer solely a matter of one's own strength. Something also has to go wrong at Red Bull, especially for the world champion. In the 19 races won by Max Verstappen since the Miami Grand Prix in 2023, the role of best of the rest has been fulfilled 5 times each by Lando, Norris, and Sergio Perez, and 3 times by Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, and Charles Leclerc. But on the only 2 occasions when things didn't go as planned for the Dutchman, the image of Carlos Sainz appeared behind him, a true sniper in deploying weekends with a great performance on the rare occasions when Max Verstappen's Red Bull showed cracks. The careers of Formula One drivers and generally those of professional athletes also go through these crossroads, being in the right place at the right time. In Carlos Sainz's case, his being there was authoritative, an important stamp put last year in the Singapore Grand Prix at the Marina Bay Street Circuit, and yesterday in Melbourne, victories of high specific importance that changed the balance of a Formula One season. For the Spaniard, who arrived in Melbourne without even the certainty of being able to take part in the race, the Albert Park weekend was probably the most rewarding since he started racing in Formula One. Charles Leclerc's smile was very different, just a little bit. As is natural for a driver, the awareness of having had a competitive car, which remains good news for the future, was not enough to mitigate the disappointment of not having secured a victory that is missing for almost 2 years. It seems like an adverse script when some Red Bull gears jam, and Charles Leclerc finds himself alongside a teammate in better shape. For Charles Leclerc, just like last year in Singapore, even last weekend, the chances of winning the Grand Prix collapsed on Saturday in qualifying, which usually is one of his main strengths. In Marina Bay, it was 79 crucial milliseconds of delay as compared to the time set by Carlos Sainz that determined his starting from the second row and the consequent unwelcome role of supporting driver. While last weekend in Melbourne, it was the decision made without careful consideration to intervene significantly on the car's setup between Q2 and Q3. Carlos Sainz was very clever in putting pressure on his Maranello teammate with the best times in Q1 and Q2. 2 results that convinced Charles Leclerc to make a change on his SF24 single-seater, a decision which ultimately turned out to be a boomerang. After the brilliant debut in red back in the 2019 Formula One Championship, overshadowing a 4-time world champion like Sebastian Vettel, Charles Leclerc has faced 4 seasons with a Ferrari almost never fighting for victory, making them very challenging championships where the Monegasque has relied mostly on his talent to give himself some satisfaction, and most often this was achieved with some impressive fast laps in qualifying. He often threw caution to the wind, an approach often very appreciated by the Ferrari fans, who for a long time could only celebrate some impressive pole positions on Saturday, aware that the prospects for Sunday's race were not great. But it's an approach that works when there's nothing to lose, otherwise it's not a method that pays off all the time. If, in the qualifying session for the Melbourne Grand Prix, Charles Leclerc had been less hasty, he would probably have overtaken Lando Norris on the starting grid. And in the race, he would have found himself behind Carlos Sainz from the first lap, with the theoretical chance to fight for the lead at the start, or during the race. Finding himself behind the McLaren car meant a change in strategy was needed, a decision that took him out of the running for victory in the Australian Grand Prix. In the hectic moments, Charles Leclerc needs the composure that Carlos Sainz has shown to possess. For the rest, no one who can distinguish a race car from a truck dreams of questioning what Charles Leclerc can give to the Maranello team and himself. If then the Scuderia manages to put its drivers in a position to constantly fight for success, regardless of Red Bull's troubles or level of competitiveness, Charles Leclerc will no longer have to hope for the perfect alignment to find victory, but the Monegasque will be called upon to field a complete package, where talent is a fundamental aspect, but not an exclusive component. The 1-2 finish in Melbourne has brought a lot of enthusiasm back the Scuderia, to the point that team principal Fred Vasseur himself, in the post-race press conference, hurried to temper the enthusiasm with the clear goal of avoiding an unrealistic escalation of expectations for the short-term future. In the general euphoria, some fans and part of the media have also returned to question the wisdom of choosing Lewis Hamilton for 2025 over Carlos Sainz. In the space of 2 weeks, there has been a shift from regret for not being able to place Oliver Bearman in the role of main driver to regret for not keeping Carlos Sainz in place, considering Lewis Hamilton's arrival in Maranello as an operation based on a lot of marketing and little substance on track. This sentiment is also felt, forgetting that just 4 months ago, Mercedes finished second in the Constructors' Championship ahead of Ferrari, mainly thanks to Lewis Hamilton's performance, a leader among those drivers who couldn't get on the track behind the wheel of a completely dominating Red Bull car. The Melbourne race also provided a clear answer to hierarchy enthusiasts, those fans who love complicated plots within a team where a first and a second driver inevitably have to coexist and work together, always and regardless of the circumstances. The fact is that there will never be great serenity between two teammates. Indeed, often beyond appearances, there is genuine sporting animosity. It is another matter to imagine fantasy scenarios, such as Carlos Sainz being demoted to a second driver role at the very moment when Lewis Hamilton's arrival in Maranello was announced last February. In Formula One, the need to establish internal hierarchies can arise when a team is competing for a world title, a context where rallying around those with greater chances of success becomes essential. In the absence of this scenario, the priority lies in the constructor standings, which brings bonuses and cash into the team's coffers. It matters little to team principals who brings in the results. What matters is securing them one way or the other. The Melbourne weekend was yet another example of this, as was the Singapore Grand Prix last year. Carlos Sainz played his cards in the best way possible, having access to the same equipment and support as Charles Leclerc, and he managed to outperform his Ferrari teammate. This made all the difference. It's black and white. Indeed, Carlos Sainz, one of the best performing drivers on the grid, advertised himself to the wider market perfectly across the Australian Grand Prix weekend, not just in Sunday's race at the 5.278-kilometre Albert Park circuit in Melbourne. In the Red Bull racing camp, there will be furrowed brows as they work to understand exactly what happened with Max Verstappen's car. The brakes on a Formula One car are sensitive things, but for issues to start so early in the race without clear explanation, a tear-off in the duct, for instance, is a concern. But there's also just a hint of encouragement there for other teams as, before the failure, Red Bull Racing wasn't a million miles up the road, even during practice and the qualifying session. As a team, it never looked like it would dominate at any point in the Australian Grand Prix weekend, with Scuderia Ferrari and McLaren both closer than they had been in the opening 2 rounds of the year. That's really good news for fans because we now head to the Suzuka circuit in Japan knowing that Red Bull Racing is fallible and doesn't have a car advantage like it did during the previous championship. Will that mean we see more winners, or that Max Verstappen won't crush the field? It's unlikely, and that remains to be seen. But there is enough to encourage us to watch on with optimism of a competitive on-track spectacle. The focus is now on the Suzuka International Racing Course, one of the world's great circuits, and one where McLaren is expected to show well at given the track characteristics and the main strengths of the McLaren MCL 38 cars driven by Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri.